We put this webinar together in response to the frustration of the pharmaceutical industry in optimizing their product launches. We're going to be talking specifically about this in the context of securing price, reimbursement and market access. Today's session is the first of a two-part series. We're going to focus on key success factors to drive access excellence. And next week, what we'll be doing is we'll be looking at using analytics to understand potential scenarios and optimize launch revenue. So what I'm going to be doing today is I'm going to talk briefly about why companies are facing such challenges. And then we'll spend the majority of the webinar today looking at some of the ways and some of the recommendations to drive launch excellence. So let's start off with looking at market access. And the way that we define market access is developing a proactive and dynamic plan that optimizes an asset's commercial reach with the most efficient and effective use of resources. Now what that means in order to optimize and achieve market access is really a balancing act between three factors. And those three factors you can see here, first of all, are targeted price or reimbursement, the time, so the time it actually takes to secure that price, reimbursement and access, and finally the reach. And when I say reach, I'm talking about the extent of the patient population that you can secure with your label. So do you actually have the full label? Do you actually have a smaller part of that label? Is it being restricted for some reason? Or perhaps you're actually getting preferential access that may be used over and above what's in the label. So let's have a look at some examples that can illustrate those points where companies have perhaps failed at not achieving the access that they'd originally set out in their goals. First of all, not gaining the targeted price or reimbursement, and in a classic case here of not appreciating or understanding the reality and anchoring their dose appropriately. What happened with Sanofi is that it launched Zaltrap. It managed to get a fairly decent price in the US for Zaltrap. But what they had done is they had anchored their price relative to the dosing of Avastin in terms of the official prescribing dose, rather than the dose that was actually used in practice and also in clinical guidelines. And what happened as a result of that is that the key stakeholders, specifically the clinicians and also the payer stakeholders, very much pushed back, and the result was that Sanofi had to halve its price of the drug in response to this criticism. So clearly not gaining very good public relations there either. Let's have a look at the time. Now J&J, a classic case here in terms of their drug for prostate cancer, Zytiga. They had some great success in certain countries in terms of getting the drug approved. Other countries it took a lot longer than anticipated to secure price and reimbursement, and particularly Italy and Ireland, the latter, Ireland, where there's a very high prevalence of prostate cancer there. It took them many more months than anticipated, and part of the reason for that is that both Italy and Ireland, and in fact the UK as well, the HDAs there had all requested a discount or at least an innovative pricing scheme, risk share scheme, to have a lower price, because their concept was that the value of the drug was not in line with the price that the company was offering. And because of the delays that they took in the negotiation and the fact that J&J didn't want to go down to those levels, it took them much longer to actually get into the marketplace. And the third example here is not optimizing the reach, so the targeted patient population. And what we see here with the example I've given with AstraZeneca and Brilinta, this really is an example that is becoming much more common as we look at HTAs and we look at the way that they're trying to really squeeze value for money from the pharmaceutical industry. And what happened here is that the company had done a clinical trial, they'd submitted it to the GBA for review, and actually in terms of the patient groups, they actually had some of the patients come back, some of the patient groups come back with no additional benefit. And the reason for that is that the authorities decided that the comparator they had used in their clinical trial was not appropriate for those particular patient subsets. So whilst it was appropriate for the vast majority, it's certainly not appropriate for all. And I think this is really a lesson that we need to learn moving forward, is that when you design a clinical trial, really at the start, you need to be thinking about patient subpopulations and making sure that the trial design, the comparator, the endpoints are actually appropriate for all of those populations. So let's have a look at some of the factors that are impacting the success of a launch, the external factors. And the factors I'm going to talk to you about today are certainly in no means exhaustive, but rather a selection of some examples. So government austerity is playing a big role at the moment, certainly not just within the US and Europe, but throughout the world. Patient power is another factor that's actually working sometimes for and sometimes against the pharmaceutical industry. And finally, in the investment community as well. So in terms of government austerity, I think we're seeing in many different countries that the result of this is that healthcare budgets are getting cut or suspended. I've got a couple of examples here of different countries within Europe who have reduced their healthcare budgets, and you can see there's Spain cutting their healthcare and education budget by 10 billion. And this is actually despite a lot of recent studies that have looked at investment in healthcare and how this can actually boost employment and spending power. So perhaps a short-term gain, but not necessarily a long-term benefit. If we have a look at the patient and patient power, so one of the tactics, shall I say, that governments used to do in terms of, well, how can we actually manage to satisfy the patient population with a reduced spend, one of the common tactics was to actually increase the levels of patient copay. But what we're seeing at the moment is that for the patient, for the individual, they're experiencing salary cuts, rising unemployment levels, and that actually means that many people have lower disposable incomes. So what's the impact of that? Certainly people are unable or less able to afford out-of-pocket payments. And also private health insurance is becoming affected with lower levels of premiums or people choosing lower levels of premiums and less coverage, or actually opting out of private healthcare insurance altogether. On the other hand, though, patient power has certainly provided a very positive role in terms of pushing and demanding therapies. So the Cystic Fibrosis Fund were certainly pivotal in supporting and gaining price reimbursement and access for Vertex's Kalydeco cystic fibrosis drug. And actually, the example I just went through before, the J&J example with Zytiga, the prostate cancer group in Ireland were again pivotal in supporting access for that drug. So patient power and empowered patient communities certainly can support companies gaining access. And the last factor that I'd like to touch on is the investment community. Now, I'm not sure about you, but certainly every day I get briefings that come through from various different websites on email, and a lot of them are from the investment community, describing the progress of a company's stock, or whether they've had certain successes, whether they've had certain failures, and whether there are a dead cert to want to invest in. And this has really had quite a detrimental effect on a lot of the pharmaceutical industry. And what we're seeing is that pharma companies have responded in one of two ways. One is actually committing to increase sales, but as we've seen from those first two factors, that's quite difficult to do in today's environment. And the second is actually thinking, okay, well, we'll reduce our bottom line and we'll look at how we can reduce spend and how we can reduce by cutting jobs. And this example here, AstraZeneca, they have planned more than 32,000 job cuts globally since 2007. So certainly the the pharmaceutical industry is feeling the clinch of today's economic environment. I mentioned at the start that we put this together as a result of the frustrations felt by the pharmaceutical industry at the moment. And certainly the people on the line may well have felt such frustrations. Be interested if you have ever experienced any of these challenges that I'm going to go through in a moment. So first of all, we do hear people say this a lot: there's never enough time. So on one hand, assets get fast-tracked, which is great. Senior management within an industry is thinking, well, this is great. This is a very positive response, because we can, essentially it's a prior blessing from different authorities, and also we can potentially get earlier revenue. But on the other hand, the people that are doing the work within the company, they're thinking to themselves, gosh, how on earth are we actually going to be able to bring a launch forward and actually secure it and optimize it in the way that it deserves? The second one, budgets. There's never enough budget. I was talking to an ex-colleague the other day who told me that despite having responsibility for the lead hope in their oncology pipeline, he didn't actually have any budget and was fighting for budget. So budgets are getting cut, and that means that companies have to work more effectively to be able to get done what they need to get done. And one of the other challenges that we frequently hear is there's never enough people to do the work that we need to do. HR budgets are getting cut, and as a result, you've got, rather than a team of people conducting certain activities, or perhaps with a different skill set, that's being reduced to one person having to do it all. And that really is causing a lot of companies big issues. So what can you do about it? Well, what I'd like to do for the rest of the time is really to explore some different ways and models as to how you can look at driving efficiency and effectiveness in launching a new asset. In terms of the key success factors, we certainly think that there are several key success factors that you should bear in mind when you're actually looking at putting plans together. The first one of these is proactive planning, making sure that you involve key stakeholders early. And that's internal stakeholders, and it's also external stakeholders, as we'll see shortly. Open and frequent communication. It's surprising how often within companies the global team take responsibility for such a long period of time and then only involve regional or local teams when it's too late to be able to change some very important and critical decisions, like, for example, the design of a clinical study or the comparator that's used. Tangible assessments of goals. Now, if you have a tangible assessment, you're more likely to be objective in allocating your resources and allocating your budget. And certainly that's something that's critical in this current environment. Producing analytical simulations helps you understand, well, where do I need to place the best resources? And by having a tangible assessment of goals, you're more able to be objective in that process. When you've actually got a more tangible assessment of goals, that also allows you to produce ongoing performance assessments. People understand how their goals are going to be assessed, so they can also be able to perform and track and benchmark the way that they are progressing in this. So ongoing performance assessments that should really be determined by the people that are responsible for the activities, and also continuous benchmarking so that the company is able to see, are we moving in the right direction? And if we're not moving in the right direction, to be able to recognize that and change track sooner rather than later. So what we've done is we have looked at a 5-step process actually to support and drive market access excellence. And the key steps that I want to talk to you about today in this part 1 session are looking at developing the activities, the roadmap, and then also tracking and benchmarking performance. In part 2 next week, we'll be looking at the what if and looking at scenario analysis and how that can support dynamic launch plans, which are certainly very important in the current environment of international price referencing and parallel trade. So I'm going to be focusing the time on those first 3 steps. Let's have a look at each of those steps then. So first of all, determining the activities. This is essentially what do we need to do and why do we need to do it. And I stress the why because it's very important that everybody understands the consequences of not doing it. And quite frankly, if you can't explain or describe the consequence of not doing it, it would suggest why you were doing it in the first place. So really this is all about understanding the really important and urgent activities that need to be done. Rather than following a pretty looking template, because that's what we've always done within this company, really think about what are we doing and why are we actually doing it. And perhaps if you do ask yourself that question, what's the consequence of not doing this, it might put you in a better position to be able to understand, well, which is really essential, which is really important, and when do they need to be done. The next is the roadmaps, and this is all about who is doing which activity and when should they be doing it. And going through this, if you can actually highlight the launch critical activities, so which are those that we definitely need to do, that will certainly help make your process much more efficient. And the last part is tracking performance. This is really looking at, well, how are we doing? How are we actually progressing? And by having a tracking system, it can ensure that or at least highlight where we are on track, but more importantly, it can highlight areas of concern if activities fall behind schedule. And I think being able to highlight those launch critical activities and tracking those launch critical activities, that can really give you an understanding of, okay, if we don't do activity A, B, and C, does it really matter? No, we need to make sure that we're focusing on activity D. And by highlighting that and tracking it, then you're better able to ensure that you're moving in the right direction. And again, using your resources in the most efficient and effective manner. So let's explore these 3 activities in more detail. First of all, starting off with understanding, well, which are the important and the urgent activities that we should be looking at. So we would consider 8 key segments of activities. And you can see them here, starting off with environmental assessment and the planning. What's actually happening in the market environment now, and how's that changing into the future when we actually come to launch our product. The competitors. What's, again, happening now, what's in the pipeline for the future activity, and how can we track that? The health economics and outcomes research, strategy and planning. What kind of endpoints, what kind of evidence do we need to be able to convince stakeholders in a compelling way? The infrastructure optimization, how do we actually organize ourselves to make sure that we can execute this plan with excellence? The pricing strategy and planning, how do we actually optimize a price not just within a country, within a region, but actually look at doing that across the globe to make sure that we can leverage the benefits of international price referencing rather than have that work against us. The access strategy and planning, I'm going to use that as an example today as we go through, but really that's looking at, okay, you've got your price, you've got your reimbursement, but what about securing access? What about even striving for preferential access for your drug? How do you do that? The medical marketing planning, that's really looking at how do you communicate to the medical stakeholders in the most compelling way. And finally, stakeholder engagement, which is becoming more and more critical in terms of understanding who are the decision makers, who are the influencers of those decision makers, and what makes them tick. How do we actually communicate with them? How do we engage with them to make sure that we're actually in a win-win? So each of those 8 activity segments supports 3 launch strategy platforms that you can see here. Optimizing asset value, shaping the access landscape, and promoting organizational excellence. And just for the purpose of an illustration, what I'm going to do today is I'm going to use the access strategy and planning as an example. Excuse me. So bearing this all in mind, how does the pharmaceutical industry currently work? Well, the industry tends to favour compartmentalising strategy, so really looking at which organisation, which function does this, which function does that, and how can I split them into silos. Now, whilst that might help in terms of understanding who is doing what, it doesn't necessarily provide the balance, the flexibility to be able to succeed, bearing in mind those issues that I talked about in terms of the environment at the moment. So by defining excuse me, those activities at a global level, but also understanding sooner rather than later the local market drivers, companies can better aim for launch success. So what you can see here on this image is that global teams, they really should be involved pretty much throughout to launch. The regional teams, and I think this is a complication that happens a lot, is that they're not brought in earlier enough. And really, optimally, a regional team should be coming in at phase 2. We see a lot of regional teams not even being brought in until phase 3. And a lot of the responses are the ones that I was talking about before. We don't have the budget, we don't have the resources. By actually going through this process and identifying the consequences of not doing the certain activities, you've got more chance of providing that rationale for the resource and the budget that you need. So I mentioned I was going to use market access assessment and planning as an example. Let's have a look at that and in terms of how some of those roadmaps would work. So what we recommend for the roadmaps is that each activity has metrics, and those metrics are agreed with the global team, the regional team, the local team, essentially the individuals that are responsible for performing that activity. And within that, launch critical activities are highlighted. And as I mentioned before, it's imperative that the corresponding rationale and the implications of not completing that activity are highlighted. And that really makes people focus, makes people understand, okay, this is what I need to do, and if I don't, I realise the consequences of doing that. So let's have a look at an example here. What you can see are some activities that are highlighted. The ones that are in bold and italics, they could be examples of launch critical activities. Now clearly, those activities all need to be tailored to a particular asset, a particular therapy area, and also the company themselves. I mean, certain companies have more resources available to them than others. But if we actually just pick, for example, this activity, looking at entering into strategic advice with the national authority. Now again, this is something that at the moment a lot of pharma companies are debating doing, thinking, well, if we enter into advice with the authority, then we're pretty much stuck with what they tell us at an early stage. That might be true, but at least it allows you to plan for what the agency need and also contingencies if you don't actually get that. So we look at a couple of examples here. In the UK, in England, sorry, with NICE, they rejected Pfizer's oncology drug because of the comparator that was used. And if Pfizer had actually engaged a bit earlier with NICE or understood that, they might not have been in the situation that they ended up in. A very well discussed case with Boehringer in Germany was their DPP-4 inhibitor, and the trial that they used, the trial design that they used was not, the GBA did not believe that was appropriate. However, you can see in other countries it was certainly considered appropriate. So entering into strategic advice with the authorities that are going to be a critical part of your launch success is very, very important, and prioritising those. Now, I mentioned an operational roadmap. What you can see here on the right-hand side of the screen is an example of that. So each roadmap should be conducted depending on the specific activities. You can see with the area I've highlighted here, we're looking at some specific activities that fall into the environmental assessment and planning bucket. And what you can actually do is, and what I would certainly recommend, that we've seen it work in the past, is that each team member has an understanding of when do they need to start the activity, when have they actually started it, when should it be finished, and when has it actually finished. But also you can maybe see here the launch critical activities. Which are those that if we only focus on these activities, we will still have a successful launch? And which are the other activities that are nice to have? They might help optimize it, but they're not critical to the success of this launch. So being able to highlight those and see them is certainly very important. And then also, the other thing that certainly helps is highlighting the status, the progress of activities. And we certainly use a very simple traffic light system. I've seen other systems in operation that are very convoluted and very complex, but essentially at the end of the day, the more complex you make this system and this scheme, the less individuals are wanting to actually engage in a system like this. This should be very simple and easy to use, and to allow all of the individuals within the organization to show how they're progressing. Actually having the individual who is performing the activity to do the performance assessment certainly helps as well, because it promotes their ownership and it promotes the endorsement of the specific activity. Okay, let's have a look at the last area, which is tracking progress and performance. So I mentioned before the idea of having an objective-based template and tangible assessment of activities. And by having that, the individual that's completing the activity is very clear on what do I need to achieve and how do I know I've achieved that. But also gaining ownership of those activities before they happen is very important to be able to reinforce an endorsement and avoid any concept of blame culture coming through. Now, we do have some clients that we work with that are not so keen about tracking performance and thinking that it's going to have some kind of big brother culture coming in. Also the time and investment that's needed by individuals to actually track their performance. And that's why I mentioned before, it should be a very simple way to do that. But actually, we found that tracking performance is certainly more positive than not. So why is that? Well, first of all, it helps ensure that teams are on track, individuals are on track, and completing the activities that they need to. But also, by highlighting those launch critical activities, you're better able to see, okay, what is the potential gap? What is the risk if I don't do this? And to be able to see it quickly enough that you can change the track, you can actually put contingency plans into place. And that's the critical and pivotal point here, is understanding if something's going wrong or if something is going in the way that it shouldn't be. It doesn't necessarily have to be impacted by internal issues. It could be external changes in the environment that have happened to make this change. Actually doing it quickly enough allows you to create a corrective course of action. The other benefit of doing this and understanding the launch critical activities is that companies are more able to use those scarce resources. I haven't got enough budget, I haven't got enough people to do this. They're more able to understand, how can I use them in the most efficient way? If I'm only focusing on 25% of the activities, which 25% should I be focusing on and why? So in terms of tracking it, here's an example of an activity status board. And this is something that we use over the web because it's very simple and easy to do. And I think having a dedicated portal for each individual, for each person that's responsible for completing an activity, to be able to simply and quickly view the activities that need to, and to be able to report their progress. If they can be able to do that very, very quickly, that certainly is the key success factor to encourage people to use this tool. And also the benefits then for the global teams or for senior management that are tracking progress, to be able to see how things are moving and also why. I mentioned before the importance of highlighting the launch critical activities, and I certainly think, a lot of times, again, I've seen in the past launch systems that are used that are convoluted and complex, but also not accurate in the way that they track activities, because it might be that a team, for example, you can see the Italian team, I don't want to pick on Italy, but the Italian country there is highlighted in red. Now, they might be red if you look at all of the overarching activities. It might be that they're behind overall in the different activities. However, if you understand the launch critical activities and how they're progressing with those, it might be that the country, the team there, are actually progressing quite well, and in fact they're just using their resources in the most efficient way. So rather than tracking everything, we would certainly recommend, and what we've seen work well in the past, is to be able to view and track your activities by the activity itself, but also by the segment, those 8 segments I reviewed before, and most importantly by the launch critical activities that you have. Okay? So let's have a look at the next slide, and this is really the summary of everything that we're going to be doing. So today I talked about part 1, which is facing up to the operational challenge, and there are certain success factors that I went through in planning and tracking market access excellence. I'm just going to list those again because I think it's important just to take a couple of minutes to spend some time to go through those. So the first one is proactive planning, and I mentioned involving key internal stakeholders early. It might be that people are saying that they don't have the resource, they don't have the time to be able to be involved early on. It's incredibly important that they do have a say early on. It helps to gain endorsement, to gain buy-in to the strategy. But over and above that, it certainly helps to make sure that the local dynamics, the local market environment, and that intelligence is brought in early on. Otherwise, we see, like we have done at the start of the presentation, that companies are not able to achieve the price of the reimbursement that they want. They're not able to achieve the total target patient population, and perhaps it takes much longer to satisfy certain authorities to get approval because their specific requirements are not being met. So involving key internal stakeholders early is essential to be able to gain that knowledge and leverage that knowledge that individuals have. Open and frequent communication, making sure that the global team is talking to the regional team, is talking to the affiliate team, and that knowledge is actually brought back and communicated within the organisation. Again, a lot of the time we see just one-way communication rather than actually an open dialogue and discussion. So that's, again, incredibly important. I talked a lot about the goals and making sure that they are tangible, because without having a tangible assessment, it's incredibly difficult to be able to understand, well, how are we actually tracking for progress? Are we working in the right way? Analytical simulations. We'll focus much more on this next week, and looking at scenario analysis. But this is really important to understand. Okay, I have limited resources, I have limited budget. What do I need to do to be able to use that in the best way? Having the ongoing performance assessments performed or done by the team, the individual that's responsible for the activity, certainly helps gain endorsement and champion that particular activity. So that's important that they do it, but also not just once, that it's done on an ongoing basis, so that you're better able to track the progress of launch planning. And then the final is the continuous benchmarking. So let's assume you have an asset in oncology or urology, for example. You might have something very similar coming down the pathway a year later. Actually utilizing the knowledge and the expertise that you have gained in determining your activities, developing the roadmaps and tracking performance is important to help you develop goals for the next asset coming down the pipeline. And to be able to leverage that learning and that knowledge in terms of making sure that the benchmarks that you've got are accurate, that they are pushing the boundaries, so that future successes in your pipeline can also be achieved as well. So I mentioned next week we're going to go through and look at the dynamic approach. We're going to look at some scenario simulations to be able to make sure that you can understand, well, how do we actually optimize revenue immediately from launch and benefit rather than be hindered by international price referencing.